Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where we do a fair and objective analysis of the church and its truth claims, its history, doctrine, and policy. So we're continuing with our series on Joseph Smith's polygamy. In part 9, if you didn't watch it, go back and watch it. We looked at the public denials of Joseph Smith, where he made particular denials at certain times that he was not a polygamist. We had a look at were these carefully worded denials, or did they just seem like public deception? So go back and watch that one. In part 10, we're going to be looking at John C Bennet and some of the accusations he made against Joseph Smith. So let's dive in. So we're going to start off by reading what the church has to say on their website. So John C Bennet was born in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. He married Mary A. Barker in 1826 and moved to Nauvoo, Illinois in 1840, where he was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He helped draft and secure the Nauvoo City Charter that same year, and in 1841 to 42, he served as assistant president in the First Presidency and held many high civic and social positions. In 1842, Bennet was excommunicated for adultery, removed from many of his civic and social positions, and divorced from his wife. After his disaffection from the church, he publicly accused Joseph Smith of committing adultery and planning the May 1842 attempt to kill former Missouri Governor Lilburn W. Boggs. Bennet also urged Missouri and Illinois officials to renew the 1838 charge of treason against Joseph Smith, which resulted in Joseph Smith's arrest in June 1843. So this is kind of the faithful position on John C. Bennet and his claims of spiritual wifery and that this originated from Joseph Smith. So this comes from josephsmithpolygamy.org. In the late 1840, John C. Bennet arrived in Nauvoo to join the Latter-day Saints and advance the cause of the Latter-day Saints. He was quickly elected Nauvoo mayor and appointed an assistant to the First Presidency by the summer of 1842. His situation drastically changed, having been accused of practicing spiritual wifery, which had nothing to do with Joseph Smith's private teachings of celestial plural marriage. Spiritual wifery was little more than illicit sexual relations kept secret. Bennet soon left the Saints and immediately published several over-the-top accusations against Joseph. His antics created a momentary pause in the spread of secret plural marriage and created confusion among believers. So the position of apologists is that while plural marriage was being practiced secretly, that Bennet was doing his own sort of unauthorized spiritual wifery. We're going to look at maybe where he got the idea from, but he claimed that he was authorized by Joseph Smith to have illicit sexual relations with women. And he also then, when he was exposed and then excommunicated, he made a series of accusations against the prophet. So how close were Joseph and Bennet? So according to Mormon polygamy documents, so skeptics may assume that the prophet had confided in Bennet regarding polygamy or spiritual wifery, and both were guilty of the same behaviors. According to this theory, the prophet elevated him so the two men could work more closely together in their endeavors. Then when Bennet rebelled, the prophet sought to destroy his reputation by fabricating accusations against Bennet's morality. Available documents show that Bennet never formally functioned as a member of the First Presidency or as a counselor to them in any meaningful way. He seldom, if ever, met in private counsel with Joseph or other church leaders. Now, the one thought that is popping to my head is it's still possible that Joseph could have talked to Bennet in private, because at this stage, I know William Law didn't know about polygamy until 1843. So even if he wasn't present in the First Presidency meetings, that wouldn't have been where Joseph would have been discussing and most likely teaching plural marriage. So these are some thoughts by critics. So this comes from LDS Discussions. Just as Joseph Smith begins ramping polygamy up in late 1841, he introduced a very interesting teaching that he dictated in his journal. So this is November 7th, 1841. It says, "I charge the saints not to follow the example of the adversary in accusing the brethren. And I said, if you do not accuse each other, God will not accuse you. If you have no accusers, you will enter heaven. And if you will follow the revelations and instructions which God gives you through me, I will take you into heaven as my backload. If you will not accuse me, I will not accuse you. If you will throw a cloak of charity over my sins, I will over yours. For charity covereth a multitude of sins. What many call sin is not sin. I do many things to break down superstition, and I will break it down." So he's saying that if we don't accuse each other, God will not accuse us, and that charity will cover a multitude of sins. Now, the author of LDS Discussions saying that this teaching from Joseph is quite interesting, in that the rumors that had been going around about his infidelity to Fanny Alger, and now it is the beginning of a system of polygamy that will only amplify these rumors. So here Joseph is stating explicitly that if other church members do not accuse Joseph of sins or each other, he would not accuse them. To be clear, Joseph Smith is completely circumventing the idea of sin in order to get members to throw a cloak of charity of his sins. Now, it's speculation whether or not Joseph Smith is referring to acts of, spiritual wifery and sleeping with other women as sins to be covered with charity and not to be accused of. We don't know exactly, but it seems that Bennet might have ran with this teaching. The people who were cut off from the church testify that they learned these practices from Joseph Smith, and this was confirmed by the women they seduced in the practice of spiritual wifery. So there was a high council, and many of the women were called forth and testified of both Joseph's brother William Smith and John C Bennet, pretty much tricking them into having illicit sexual relations, and that it came from Joseph Smith, that he authorized it. William Smith has also been to my house. This is Catherine Fuller. On the 27th of last month, being the day I was married, and proposed unlawful connection, but I refused and told him that it was contrary to the teaching of Joseph on the stand. He answered that Joseph was obliged to teach to the contrary on the stand, to keep down prejudice and keep peace at home. First, William Smith insisted very much that I should not marry, and proposed to supply me with food, etc., if I should remain unmarried and grant his requests. So Sarah Miller, she testified that she was told the teaching of spiritual wifery originated with Joseph Smith. Some 2 or 3 weeks since, in consequence of Brother Joseph Smith's teachings to the singers, I began to be alarmed concerning myself and certain teachings which I had received from Chauncey L. Higby, and I questioned him about his teaching. For I was pretty well persuaded from Joseph's public teachings that Cheney had been telling falsehood. But Chauncey said that Joseph now taught as he did through necessity, on account of prejudices of the people and his own family particularly, as they had not become full believers in the doctrine. Okay, so she is being told by Chauncey Higby that Joseph Smith did teach this doctrine secretly, and that he was the one that authorized it. Another account by Margaret J. Nyman also confirms this. During the evening's interview, he, as I have since learned, with wicked lies proposed that I should yield to his desires and indulge in sexual intercourse with him, stating that such intercourse might be freely indulged in and was no sin, that any respectable female might indulge in sexual intercourse, and there was no sin in it, providing the person so indulging keep the same to herself, for there could be no sin where there is no accuser. And most clandestinely, with wicked lies, persuaded me to yield by using the name of Joseph Smith, and as I have since learned, totally false and unauthorized, and in consequence of those arguments, I was influenced to yield to my seducer, Chauncey L. Higby. So you had John C. Bennet, Chauncey L. Higby, William Smith, who were apparently using the name of Joseph to seduce women into having illicit sexual relations, and using the teaching that if we have no accusers, then we won't be accused, and there is no sin. But she is saying that it was unauthorized and that she was deceived. So let's talk a little bit about Sarah Pratt. So this was Orson Pratt's wife. So sometime in late 1840, 1841, Joseph Smith confided to his friend that he was smitten by the amiable and accomplished Sarah Pratt and wanted her for one of his spiritual wives. So this comes from John C Bennet. For the Lord had given her to him as a special favor for his faithfulness. Shortly afterward, the two men took some of Bennet's sewing to Sarah's house. During the visit, as Bennet described it, Joseph said, "Sister Pratt, the Lord has given you to me as one of my spiritual wives. I have the blessings of Jacob granted me, as God granted holy men of old, and as I have long looked upon you with favour and an earnest desire of connubial bliss, I hope you will not repulse or deny me, and this that the great secret that I am not to utter." Sarah replied, "Am I called upon to break the marriage covenant and prove recreant to my lawful husband? I never will." She added, "I care not for the blessings of Jacob. I have one good husband, and that is enough for me." But according to Bennet, the prophet was persistent. Finally, Sarah angrily told him on a subsequent visit, Joseph, if you ever attempt anything of the kind with me again, I will make a full disclosure to Mr. Pratt on his return home. Dependent upon it, I will certainly do it. Sister Pratt, the prophet responded, I hope you will not expose me, for if I suffer, all must suffer. So do not expose me. Will you promise that you will not do it? If you will never insult me again, Sarah replied, I will not expose you unless strong circumstances should require it. If you should tell, the prophet added, I will ruin your reputation. So according to Bennet's account, he's saying that Joseph looked upon Sarah Pratt and wanted her for a plural wife, that there was obviously some sexual desires towards her, that he made advances towards her to be one of his plural wives, that he had the blessings of Jacob. Sarah angrily refused him, and she said she's happy with her husband, and Joseph then gave the threat that if you expose me, that I'll destroy your reputation. Now, this account comes from John C Bennet. So we don't know, is he embellishing things? Is this how it happened? But this is their account. This comes from Grant Palmer's book, Restoring Christ. He says that Joseph Smith did not think of a marriage or sealing ceremony for many years. He used to state to his intended victims, as he did to me, so this comes from Sarah Pratt, God does not care if we have a good time, if only other people do not know it. He only introduced a marriage ceremony when he had found out that he could not get certain women without it. I think Louisa Beeman was the first case of this kind. So if this account is true, that Joseph Smith was really just trying to seduce women into having sexual relations with them and teaching that God doesn't care as long as nobody else knows, then obviously this is a really bad teaching, and would definitely call into question his validity as a righteous prophet. But this comes from Sarah Pratt. Now, it is an antagonistic source. So here's a response to some of these quotes by John C Bennet and Sarah Pratt. The dramatic in these alleged conversations appear to be Bennet's elaborations. He refers to spiritual wifery, a term Joseph Smith never used except in derision. The revelation on celestial and plural marriage dictated by the prophet in section 132 contains no mention of the word spiritual or wifery. Interestingly, Bennet did not adopt other terms like everlasting wifery, celestial wifery, eternal wifery, or spiritual marriage, which is evidence that Joseph's teachings and Bennet's claims were completely unrelated to each other and cast significant doubt that Joseph Smith would have ever used the term as Bennet alleged. An additional problem with Sarah's alleged account, as filtered through John C. Bennet, is that the evidence strongly supports that they were sexually involved with each other. In August of 1842, non-Mormon J.B. Backenstoss signed an affidavit charging Dr. John C. Bennet with having illicit intercourse with Mrs. Orson Pratt and some others. When said, Bennet replied that she made a first-rate go, and from personal observations, I should have taken said Dr. Bennet and Mrs. Pratt as man and wife had I not known to the contrary. Ebenezer Robinson similarly reported in 1890, in the spring 1841, Dr. Bennet had a small, neat house built for Elder Orson Pratt's family, Sarah and one child, and commenced boarding with them. Elder Pratt was absent on a mission to England. John D. Lee recalled he, John C. Bennet, became intimate with Orson Pratt's wife while Pratt was on a mission, that he built her a fine frame house and lodged with her and used her as his wife. Another Nauvoo recalled that Joseph Smith tried to intervene. So there's actually, from these quotes, that there's actually some differences between spiritual wifery and Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage, and Bennet does not seem to be aware of the sort of celestial, sealing, eternal aspect and a marriage ceremony being part of it, or the theology. And also it is claimed by many sources that actually Sarah Pratt and John C. Bennet were having an adulterous affair. So we're going to read on. So this is what Bennet had to say about eternal marriage. So he published a letter in the Iowa Hawkeye, and this was edited by James G. Edwards and printed in Burlington. So after addressing Edwards, Bennet wrote this. So he's now finding out about, eternal marriage and celestial wives. So according to promise, I now address you a few lines in relation to the new doctrine of marrying for eternity, lately gotten up by the holy Joe. For the benefit of his flock, Joe says that as they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels which are in heaven, In eternity, it has been revealed to him that there will be no harmony in heaven unless the saints select their companions and marry in time for eternity. They must marry in time so as to begin to form that sincere attachment and unsophisticated affection which is so necessary to consummate in eternity in order to the peace of heaven. So Joe Smith has lately been married to his present wife Emma for eternity as well for time. This marrying for eternity is not the spiritual wife doctrine noticed in my expose, The History of the Saints, but is an entirely new doctrine established by special revelation, the spiritual wives for time and the celestial wives for eternity. Bennet presents marrying for eternity as a new revelation, an accusation, in essence, that the prophet created revelation on convenience after Bennet left Nauvoo. So he's saying that Joseph Smith is evolving the practice, according to Bennet, from spiritual wifery now to eternal celestial marriage, according to Bennet. This is Fair Latter-day Saints' response. So they would say, I think it is probable that Bennet and Sarah were engaged in an illicit affair. When Joseph learned of it, he was incensed and worried, given that he entered plural marriage with the wives of other apostles and was also sealed to some women whose husbands were not faithful church members. It is possible that he did offer Sarah a plural marriage. I suspect that he did. The tenure and circumstances of that offer, however, have doubtless been distorted beyond all recognition by Bennet and Sarah. Given Joseph's apparent belief that the sealing power could both bind him to faithful members and possibly save the less valiant, he may have hoped to link himself more tightly to Orson and help redeem Sarah from her folly. If so, he succeeded in his first goal, but failed in the second. So this is kind of speculation on the church's side, but they're saying a possible scenario is that Joseph Smith was aware that they're having an adulterous affair. Perhaps Joseph was going to expose them, but then he offered this offer of being sealed to Joseph as his plural wife to Sarah, and perhaps that was the involvement and the accounts of Bennet that he was just trying to seduce Orson's wife and wanted to have sexual relations with her, that is just sort of distorting what actually happened and embellishing things. We don't really know exactly what happened. Abortions in Nauvoo. So there were some claims that there were abortions. So this comes from Restoring Christ, Grant Palmer's book. I observed that he held something in the left sleeve of his coat. Bennet smiled and said, "Oh, a little job for Joseph. One of his women is in trouble." Saying he took the thing out of his left sleeve. It was a pretty long instrument of a kind I had never seen before. It seemed to be steel and crooked at one end. Now, there is an affidavit by Hiram that Bennet would give medicine to produce abortions if some of the women would get pregnant that he was sleeping with. This comes from Hiram Smith. Sarah Pratt, she claimed that you often hear that Joseph had no polygamous offspring. The reason of this is very simple. Abortion was practiced on a large scale in Nauvoo. Dr. John C Bennet, the evil genius of Joseph, brought this abomination into a scientific system. He showed to my husband and me the instruments with which he used to operate for Joseph. There was a house in Nauvoo right across the flat, about a mile and a half from the town, a kind of hospital. They sent the women there where they showed signs of celestial consequences. Abortion was practiced regularly in this house. So she's saying the reason no children pop up in Nauvoo is because they're keeping the practice secret, and if any women did get pregnant, that Bennet would have an instrument to perform abortions. So this is Brian Heal's response to these allegations. However, the likelihood that he performed abortions on any of Joseph Smith's plural wives seems highly unlikely. As discussed above, little evidence supports that the prophet confided in him regarding any of his plural marriage dealings, although I do believe that Bennet, in his expose, he did correctly identify some of Joseph Smith's wives, and Brian Hales does acknowledge that. Bennet's lack of knowledge of authorized Nauvoo polygamy reveals him to have been an outsider who was not consulted for any purpose associated with the practice. Sarah Pratt's timeline is also problematic. When Joseph Smith and Bennet split in early 1842, Joseph was arguably the only man practicing authorized polygamy. Also, there is no evidence that Louisa Beeman or Agnes Culbreth had become pregnant. They were the only two plural wives with whom I believe he would have experienced sexual relations. It seems if Bennet had performed abortions during his 22-month stay in Nauvoo, they would have been on women who he or his followers had impregnated, but no supportive evidence has been found. Sarah Pratt made other statements that contradict more reliable historical data. So Brian Hales is saying that really that there's not enough evidence to support this, that there's some, unreliability to their accounts, that he says there only could have been two possible women, most likely that he would have had sexual relations with, because Brian believes that there weren't sexual relations in any of the marriages to women with living husbands. So it's a bit confusing, but the evidence isn't super strong or reliable when it comes to Nauvoo abortions. But at the same time, we don't really know it. It's hard to tell. So Bennet's sins and church discipline. So Bennet resigned as mayor the same day and also confessed his sins in the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge later that afternoon. So this was after he was exposed at the High Council and women testifying against him. 2 days later, the day Joseph was elected as mayor, Bennet made a similar confession to the city council. In his confession of misdeeds he had committed, he defended the honour of Joseph Smith and expressed his sincere desire to return to full fellowship with the saints, stating that he looked forward to the time when I may be restored to full confidence and fellowship and my former standing in the church. He was later subsequently exposed as being expelled from the Pickaway Masonic Lodge in Ohio. And it's interesting that, Bennet here in this quote, that he expresses that he sort of confesses his sins, and he also defends Joseph Smith, and that it didn't actually come from Joseph Smith, these teachings, and he wants to get himself back in favor with the church. So this comes from Mormon Polygamy documents. So Bennet, Daniel H. Wells, an alderman of said city of Nauvoo, said that John C. Bennet, who being dully sworn according to the law, deposes and saith that he never was taught anything in the least contrary to the strictest principles of the gospel or of virtue, or of the laws of God or man, under any circumstances or upon any occasion, either directly or indirectly, in word or deed by Joseph Smith, and that he never knew the said Smith to countenance any improper conduct whatever, either in public or private, and that he never did teach to me in private an illegal illicit intercourse with females was, under any circumstances, justifiable, and that I never knew him so to teach others. So this is a very important statement that here Bennet seems to be given this signed affidavit or sworn, I don't know if he signed it, that Joseph Smith never in public or private taught him that he could have illegal, illicit sexual intercourse with women. So this would almost seem like Bennet is contradicting himself, which really does call into question how reliable is Bennet and all the allegations he made if here he is stating and testifying that he was never taught this by Joseph Smith. So Joseph Smith exercised extreme patience with John C. Bennet concerning forgiveness. The prophet taught the Relief Society in May 1842 that they are fellow mortals. We loved them once, shall we not encourage them to reformation? We have not yet forgiven them 70 times 7. As our Saviour directed, perhaps we have not forgiven them once. There is now a day of salvation to such as repent and reform, and they who repent not should be cast out from this society. Yet we should woo them to return to God, lest they escape not the damnation of hell. By the late spring of 1842, it was obvious that the mayor was not going to change his immoral conduct. When finally confronted, he said he had seduced 6 or 7 women in the city, and he said if he was forgiven, he would not be guilty anymore. However, Bennet's improprieties could no longer be ignored. He resigned as mayor on this May 17th and was disfellowshipped. That day, he signed a public confession, which we looked at in the previous one. According to the Prophet's Journal, Bennet replied, I publicly avow that anyone who has said that I have stated that General Joseph Smith has given me authority to hold illicit intercourse with women is a liar in the face of God. Those who have said it are damn liars. They are infernal liars. He never, either in public or private, gave me any such authority or license, and any person who states it is a scoundrel and a liar. Months later, in a meeting of the 12 apostles dated January 20th, 1843, Joseph Smith told Orson, Sarah lied about me. I never made the offer which she said I did. In 1845, Orson Pratt was interviewed by Sidney Rigdon. After the interview, Rigdon concluded that Orson was literally telling the people that all Smith said about his wife was true. Rigdon added he has left on the character of his wife a stain by this degraded condescension that he can never wash out. Pratt is determined to make us believe it by virtually declaring it was true, for if he was wrong when he called Smith a liar, then his wife was guilty of the charges preferred. Now, obviously, this is coming from Joseph's journal, but apparently Bennet gave a sort of sworn affidavit saying that he was never taught this in private or in public by Joseph Smith, the spiritual Wifery, and Orson Pratt believed that Joseph was telling the truth, that he didn't try to seduce his wife, that Sarah was lying about him, and that John C. Bennet and Sarah were having adultery. So did Bennet know about polygamy? The fact that he knew the identities of some of the prophet's plural wives could be evidence that the two had personally spoken on the subject. However, it is also possible that his source was Nancy Rigdon and her suitor Francis Higby, who was Bennet's close associate. The erotic titillation, heightened by gossip and rumours of plural marriage, that had some basis in fact and intensified by the lure of secret making and secret keeping, could have easily seemed appealing to the curious and confused. Bennet provided medical care to Nancy Rigdon when she was sick in early 1842, which could easily have been where he became aware both of Sidney Rigdon's negative reaction to plurality. But again, I think this is speculation. We don't know where John C. Bennet got the information from. He claims he got it from Joseph Smith. Also, Higby was the link transmitting Joseph's happiness letter from Nancy to Bennet. Bennet's flow of information appears to have stopped sometime after March 9, 1842. Joseph's next plural marriage to Miranda Johnson Hyde occurred in April 1842 and was not included on Bennet's list. The prophet proposed plural marriage to Nancy on April 9, 1842, and may have told Nancy of a few of his previous sailings as an attempt to persuade her the practice was legitimate. Thus, she could have passed the information on to Bennet, either directly or indirectly. Again, this is it's possible. This is plausible. That may have been where you got the information from, but again, it's a bit of speculation. So, a summary from Brian Hales. Admittedly, other interpretations of the limited historical evidences are possible, and it's undeniable that Bennet was positioned to hear rumours. Rumours about polygamy, rumours about time and eternity, rumours about consecrated oil, rumours about the identities of plural wives. However, his apparent distance from the nucleus of Nauvoo polygamy requires all authors who quote him to exercise great caution. Those who would portray him as a polygamy confidant of Joseph Smith would need to also present documentation to validate that interpretation. So this has been kind of a long episode, but this is sort of like my summary of what we've gone through. So John C. Bennet, he lived in Nauvoo between 1840 and 1842. He served as mayor and assistant to the first presidency. He also, I don't know if I mentioned this, but he did have a reputation, and there's accounts saying that he was an adulterer before he came to Nauvoo. But when Bennet, he was teaching spiritual wifery and he was seducing women, claiming that the teaching came from Joseph, that Joseph was doing it himself. You know, if there's no accuser, then there's no sin. Sarah Pratt also claimed that Joseph tried to seduce her and to take her for a plural wife. Yet other sources claim that Sarah and Bennet were having an adulterous affair when Orson was on a mission. Apologists state that there's actually vast differences between Bennet's spiritual wifery of secret illicit sexual relations with eternal plural marriage, with the ceremony and with all the theology. There are claims of Joseph authorizing abortions in Nauvoo, but the evidence isn't strong to support this claim. There are accounts of Bennet acknowledging and confessing his sins before the High Council and denying that he was taught this practice by the prophet. Bennet did seem to know some of Joseph's wives, but it's not conclusive whether he got it from Joseph or if there are rumors being spread around. So overall, this is sort of my take on John C. Bennet and Sarah Pratt. I know a lot of the accusations they make at first can be really troubling, and part of you can think that, oh, maybe he was an insider, maybe he's telling the truth, maybe all these really awful shenanigans were happening and polygamy was quite secret anyway. But overall, I think, like Brian Hales says, we should be somewhat cautious when it comes to some of the accusations made by John C. Bennet. While I think it's possible that he could have been an insider, he could have been telling the truth, exposing Joseph Smith's polygamy and his practice and it being sort of secret. I personally think that there are differences between spiritual wifery and, you know, eternal plural marriage as Joseph practiced it. Things do seem to be a bit embellished. And we also know that, you know, Bennet did write statements stating that he wasn't told this or taught this by Joseph Smith. So I think he's not the most reliable source, and we should just be careful and cautious to believe his claims and to take them at face value. But read through the documents yourself. I'm going to put all these links in the description. Have a read through them yourself. If you have enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. On the next video, we're going to be looking at Nancy Rigdon and the happiness ladder. So tune into that one. If you've enjoyed this, then please like, share, and subscribe to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph. You can also follow me on Facebook, Mormonism with the Murph, if you want to see updates of my next videos. If you care to donate to support me, you can to my PayPal, stephen.murphy1996@outlook.com. And I'll see you all very soon. Take care, everybody.